The empty quarter. For a brief moment, the silence of the desert was disturbed by a strange, wheezing, groaning sound. A blue police box materialized on top of a sand dune. The doctor came out, reeling a little. Feeling that heavy tweeds went due for the desert, he changed back into one of his usual pinstripe suits. But even in that, he was far too hot. He considered going back inside for shorts and decided he couldn't be bothered. He looked at the scene around him. All around there were sand, miles upon miles of it. Weirdly shaped dunes with oddly patterned sides. Like one he was standing on, flat, rolling areas with complex patterns traced in the sand. Nothing but sand, in every direction but one. There, directly in front of him, at the bottom of a huge shallow bowl in the desert, was an enormous building. Or rather several buildings linked by lower wings. There was a massive square tower in one corner and a smaller round one close by. Belmore Castle, murmured the doctor. Oh, you are such an excellent example of over-the-top Victorian Gothic. So, what on earth are you doing here? In the distance, just beyond the castle, stood a cluster of 3 giant metal columns. They were as tall as tower blocks, and stood on stubbly legs with extended outwards from the base of the column. They were Judoon spaceships. And why here, he wondered. Maybe the Judoon, with their usual directness, had just picked out the biggest blank space on the planet and blocked down their spaceships, and their stolen castle in the middle of it. The doctor noticed that the castle was covered with an almost invisible transparent dome. There was a kind of shimmering blur quite distinct from the desert heat haze. With a sudden crack and a bullet whizzed past his head, the doctor dropped flat in the sand. Slowly he raised his head. White-robed horsemen were thundering down the sides of the bowl. They were shouting and screaming and firing their rifles in the air. Desert raiders, crying out their usual noisy charges to terrify their enemies. Coming across the castle in the desert must have seemed like a great opportunity for a spot of looting. This time the doctor suspected they were out of luck. The leading horseman charged towards the castle and bounced back, repelled by the invisible wall. The shock of the impact sent him flying from his horse. The horse itself staggered back and collapsed in the sand. More and more attackers rode up, only to suffer the same fate. Soon there in front of the castle was a tangle of fallen men, rearing horses. Shoutings and screams, curses floated up as the angry horsemen staggered to rein their mounts and their places back in the saddle. They managed it at last and regrouped. They milled about for a while, with much swearing and shouting and shooting, but their bullets pinged off the force field around the castle. Finally, frustrated and angry, they disappeared into the desert in search, no doubt, for easier prey. The doctor waited until the last hoofed beast had died away, and then got up and made his way down the side of the dune towards the castle. He had to find some way to get inside. Something better than charging on horseback, screaming, and firing a rifle. Still, it did look pretty, he thought, as he trudged across the sand. A good old-fashioned cavalry charge, straight out of the Lawrence of Arabia, or carry on up the Kuiper, possibly Spamalot. Martha and Carthurs were waiting for the cosmic peacemaker, who was greeted them to return. He had introduced himself as Professor Trelawney, and then excused himself shortly after beginning their meeting. To Martha, it almost felt like she had moved from the past, the handsome crabs and gin places of Edwardian London, to the future. The room they sat in was furnished all in white. The furniture was sparse and simple, and the glass walls glowed with an inner light. Professor Trelawney came back into the room, his thin face full of concern. 3 white-robed figures followed him, all tall, thin, and saintly looking. These are my colleagues. They are all very anxious to hear what you have to say. Forgive the slight delay. I had something very important to attend to. Now, the device caused a disaster, you say? I was assured that it was harmless. Otherwise, of course, I should never have given it to our loyal friend Doyle. Please tell me what happened. Carthurs had carefully avoided any mention of the missing Balmoral Castle. I wasn't quite sure what to say. He looked hopefully at Martha. We are not quite sure, said Martha. The reports from Scotland are still a bit confused. and no one seems to know quite what's going on. What we need to know, Professor, is what the device is and what it's for. And more importantly, where did you get it? Chaloner sighed. I only wish I could be more helpful. The purpose, as I understand it, is to act as some kind of energy source, a huge power store in a very small space. And where does it come from? Was it developed here in the laboratories? Asked Carthurs. No, it came from abroad. It was invented or discovered by one of our foreign colleagues. The device came to the monastery in Tibet, and a great source of ancient wisdom. Can you contact these colleagues, asked Martha. Get them to tell us what we need to know. Naturally, I shall do so immediately, said the Professor Chaloner. However, it may take a little while. It is difficult to reach such remote parts of the world. Martha nodded. I understand. Please do what you can. We mustn't take up any more of your time. They rose and Professor Chaloner showed them the door. Martha paused. I wonder if we could take a look around your laboratories before we go. Chaloner shook his head sadly. Quite out of the question, I fear. Our work here is extremely advanced, and I would be baffling and possibly dangerous if you will come this way. Minutes later, they were again climbing the dirty steps that led back to the Black Dog Lane. What do you make of that? Asked Carthurs as they reached the alley. He was playing for time, said Martha. Monastery in Tibet, my foot. Well, we didn't learn much, did we? Oh, I don't know, said Martha. As the doctor says, know your enemy. At least we got a look at him and at his headquarters, the room we sat in. What about it? Did you ever see lighting like that before? Well, no, but I'm not an expert on what is possible with the new forms of electric lighting. The room doesn't belong in this time. And there was something else. What? You remember the face that appeared in the hatch as we tried to send us away? Carthur shuddered. Regular death's head. And the door opened and there was a saintly old Chaloner. Well, it couldn't have been the same man, said Carthurs. They must have an ugly doorman who went to get him. Doorman left. Chaloner appeared. Martha shook her head. There wasn't time. But what does that mean? Martha shrugged. I don't know. But it might mean that Chaloner can change his shape. Hideous to saintly in seconds. They left Black Dog Lane and walked towards the place where they'd got out of the cab. What now? Said Carthurs. Are you going to get in touch with the doctor? Not yet. Let's go back and see your friend Sir Arthur. He told us he spent time with this cosmic peacemaker a lot. He must have learned something about them. I don't think he was telling us everything he knows. They had to walk for some time before they had reached the area where they could find another cab. When one appeared at last, Carthurs hailed it. Grand Hotel cabby. They got out of the cab and Carthurs paid off the driver. As they turned to enter the hotel, they saw Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself coming out. Arthur, called Carthurs. Just the man we need. Glad we caught you. Conan Doyle looked at him in amazement. Harry, I thought you were still in Scotland. And who's your charming young friend? Carthurs stared. You know I'm not in Scotland. We came to see you just over an hour ago. Nonsense, dear boy, said Conan Doyle. Don't be silly now. You know I haven't seen you in nearly a month.